The Last Carriage, Part 1, long Stephen King style. Opening. Most mornings, Harold Minton woke before his alarm. It wasn't because he was one of those chipper early risers you read about in magazines, those grinning maniacs jogging in the dawn light like they were in a toothpaste commercial. No, Harold was 57, a little soft in the middle, a little gray at the temples, and if he was being honest, mornings mostly felt like wading up from the bottom of a deep, black pond. But 32 years of commuting had carved habits into him like grooves in an old record, and his body knew the routine even if his mind was still half dreaming. He would sit up in bed, rub his face until it felt like his skin was on straight, then shuffle into the kitchen of his modest Chelsea apartment. The linoleum was cracked in the corners, the refrigerator hummed like a tired old man, and the single window over the sink offered a view of the neighboring brick wall that was about as inspiring as wet cardboard. Still, it was home. Coffee first, that was the rule. One heaping spoon of grounds more than the machine's instructions called for, because Harold liked his coffee like he liked the truth, strong enough to keep you awake at night. While it brewed, he'd crack 2 eggs into a pan, scatter a pinch of salt, always too much, and burn the toast slightly because he liked the smell. By 6:35, he'd be buttoning his shirt in the hallway mirror, by 6:45 locking the door, and by 7:05 he'd be standing at the platform at Chelsea Station, waiting for the 7:15 to Portsmouth. It was a routine, so fixed you could set your watch by it. Which is probably why, on that particular morning in early October, he noticed the difference. Not in a loud, something's wrong kind of way. More like the quiet feeling you get when you're walking home and realize the street lamps are flickering behind you. The station looked sharper somehow. The fog that usually rolled in from the Mystic River was there, sure, but it wasn't the soft, cottony kind Harold knew. This fog had edges. It moved like it was thinking. The station had its regulars, just like Harold. He didn't know most of their names, but he knew their rhythms. The short woman in the green coat who always arrived at the last minute, clutching a travel mug like it was the only thing keeping her alive. The college kid with a busted skateboard under one arm and an expression that said the world had already disappointed him. The elderly man with a fishing hat who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and always hummed something under his breath, like a tune only he could hear. These people were part of the background music of Harold's mornings. The station itself wasn't much to look at. 2 narrow platforms, a squat brick building with peeling white paint, and a flickering sign that sometimes forgot to display the right time. But it had a certain charm, the kind you don't notice until you've been somewhere long enough. The kind that seeps into your bones. Harold stood on his usual spot near the middle of the platform, sipping from his paper cup and watching the fog curl over the tracks. There was something hypnotic about the way it moved. Normally, you could hear the train before you saw it, a low, rumbling growl in the distance. But this morning, it came almost silently, sliding out of the mist like a ghost. Harold frowned, tilting his head. The first carriage emerged, silver gray and streaked with grime. Then the second. The third. All the same as they'd always been. But the rhythm was wrong. He knew these trains, knew the number of cars like he knew the lines in his own palm. 7. Always 7. This one had 8 that the extra carriage didn't match. Not exactly. The others were a dull, workmanlike silver. This one seemed darker, not painted but shadowed. It reflected almost nothing, as if it were swallowing the weak morning light instead of bouncing it back. Its windows weren't tinted so much as sealed, glossy black panes that offered no hint of what was inside. There was no logo on the side, no number, no graffiti tags from bored teenagers. Just smooth, unbroken darkness. Harold's first thought was that it must be some kind of maintenance car, though he'd never seen one quite like it. Maybe they'd started adding extra coaches for cargo. But that didn't explain the small detail that nagged at him. The door was open. Just a crack. Enough that if you were close, you might see a sliver of the inside. The whistle blew, sharp and urgent, snapping Harold out of his daze. People began boarding the normal cars, moving with that unthinking commuter efficiency. No one else seemed to notice the extra carriage at all. Not a single head turned in its direction. Harold hesitated, caught between the comfort of his routine and a magnetic pull of the unknown. He told himself it was just curiosity, nothing more. But later, much later, when he was lying awake and staring at the ceiling. The Last Carriage, Part 2 the next morning, Harold told himself he wouldn't even look for it. He'd get his coffee, he'd find his usual seat in car 4, and he'd pretend the last 48 hours hadn't happened. But that was the trouble with telling yourself not to think about something. It was the same as thinking about it constantly. The moment he stepped onto the platform, his eyes were sliding down the length of the train before he even realized it. And there it was, waiting at the end like a period at the end of a sentence you didn't want to read. The black carriage, its windows as blind and unreflective as ever, its doors slightly open as if in greeting. Harold felt a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the October air. He thought of the woman in the red scarf, how she'd stepped inside without hesitation and never come out again. He checked, of course, walked the platform at Portsmouth on the off chance she'd just gotten off somewhere along the line. But there had been no sign of her. No red scarf bobbing in the crowd, no quick steps to match his. She had simply vanished between one stop and the next. And yet no one seemed to care or even notice. The regulars on the platform stood in their usual spots, sipping their coffees and scrolling their phones, as if the world hadn't sprouted a hole in its side big enough to swallow a person whole. On a ride to Portsmouth, Harold found himself studying the other passengers with a new kind of intensity. He wondered if they saw it too. The man across from him, with the thinning hair and an expensive briefcase, had his gaze flicked toward the rear of the train just now? The teenager in the oversized hoodie, tapping at her phone, did her shoulders tense when the whistle blew? It was impossible to say. No one spoke about it, and maybe that was the strangest thing of all. People spoke about everything on trains. They griped about the weather, about politics, about the price of coffee. But the black carriage. Silence. As if even mentioning it might invite it closer. Harold tried to focus on his crossword, but the clues all seemed to twist into something darker. Passenger's final stop. Shadow's companion. By the time they reached Portsmouth, he'd written nothing but black squares. That evening, Harold lingered at the office longer than usual. It wasn't that he loved the paperwork or the endless emails, but he thought, ridiculously, that maybe if he caught a later train, he'd avoid it. Surely the black carriage didn't ride every route. But when he finally made his way to the platform, there it was again. The rest of the train looked almost relieved to be normal, as if the silver cars were trying to ignore their darker sibling. The carriage door was open wider this time. From where he stood, Harold thought he saw movement inside, just a flicker, like a shadow crossing a shadow. His feet carried him forward before his brain could object. He took one step, then another, until the metal of the platform's edge pressed against the soles of his shoes. The hum was back, low and almost pleasant, like the purr of a huge animal. He imagined what it might feel like to put his hand on the doorframe, to step over the threshold, to finally see what was inside. Then someone bumped into him from behind, muttering an apology, and the spell broke. He turned and walked briskly toward car 4, heart hammering, refusing to look back until the train was moving. The dreams deepened that week. Now he wasn't just standing on the platform, he was inside the carriage. The velvet seats were warm under his hands, almost pulsing, and the air smelled faintly of rain on hot pavement. Outside the black windows, shapes moved in the dark, tall and thin, keeping pace with the train. He could never quite see their faces, but he felt their attention like a weight. In one dream, the faceless conductor stood at the far end of the aisle, holding a black ticket between two white-gloved fingers. Harold wanted to refuse it, to tell the man he'd gotten on by mistake, but his hand rose of its own accord. The ticket burned cold in his palm, and when he woke, his fist was clenched so tight it took him a full minute to uncurl his fingers. There was nothing inside, of course. Nothing but the lingering smell of rain on Friday morning. Harold finally broke his silence. He cornered Kessler, the station master, as the man was checking the departure board. That last carriage, Harold began, his voice lower than he'd intended. When did they start running it? Kessler looked at him for a long moment, the way you might look at someone who's just asked if the moon is still in the sky. Last carriage, he said finally, his brow furrowing. Harold described it, the color, the windows, the open door. Kessler's frown deepened, but it didn't look like recognition. It looked like irritation. Hank didn't run at first. Not because he was brave, but because his legs refused to obey him. The cold pressed in from every side, though the night air had been hot moments ago. His breath misted in the beamless dark, and each exhale seemed to vanish faster than the one before, like something was drinking it in. The chorus of voices had stopped, but their absence was worse. It was as though they had gone silent to watch him think. The silence broke with a low hum, not mechanical, not quite human. It vibrated through the soles of his boots, up his spine, until it rattled in the hollow places of his skull. Hank forced himself to take a step forward, then another. Somewhere ahead, in the black expanse, a single point of red light appeared. At first he thought it might be a taillight again, but this one pulsed, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. As his eyes adjusted, he realized it was too high off the ground to belong to any vehicle. The hum deepened into a groan. The ground under Hank shifted, like a muscle tightening, and he nearly lost his balance. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but when he did, the horizon behind him was gone. There was no gas station, no faint glow from neon signs, no outline of the desert hills. Only a wall of pure black, so deep it felt like staring into the mouth of something alive. That was when a smell hit him. Damp, metallic, sweet in a way blood turns sweet after it dries. His stomach lurched. He swallowed hard and kept moving toward the pulsing red glow, telling himself it was just a marker light, maybe a construction zone he'd forgotten seeing in daylight. But his mind knew better. There was no construction on Gravedigger's Highway. There never had been. When he finally came close enough, the glow revealed itself for what it was, an eye. Enormous, lidless, its surface wet and glistening as it fixed on him. The pupil contracted sharply, and from somewhere in the dark came the unmistakable sound of footsteps matching his own, not following, not preceding, but walking with him, matching him step for step. The eye didn't blink, it couldn't, but it tightened somehow, the membrane around it quivering as if a thought had passed through whatever owned it. The sound of the footsteps grew sharper, no longer muffled by sand or gravel. They were deliberate now, like boots on polished stone, echoing faintly in a space that shouldn't have been open desert. Hank's breathing quickened, and the more he tried to steady it, the more ragged it became. Somewhere behind the thud of each step came a faint scrape, like a metal edge dragging lazily across rock. He dared a glance over his shoulder and saw nothing but the rolling black wall, yet the sound didn't stop. It was as if the dark itself was walking beside him, and every time he slowed, it slowed too. Then came the whisper. Not in the air, not in his ears, but inside his skull, curling behind his thoughts. It didn't speak in words at first, just a cadence like breath-shaping syllables he almost recognized. The longer it went on, the more his mind tried to make sense of it, and that was worse than not knowing. Fragments of language formed and dissolved. Keep walking. Not yet. You're almost. But almost what? Hank clenched his jaw and picked up his pace, but the glowing eye moved with him, never drawing closer, never pulling away. He realized with a sudden chill that he hadn't looked at the ground in minutes, and when he did, the sight turned his stomach. The asphalt was gone. In its place stretched a surface like pale leather, wrinkled and slightly translucent, and beneath it, something moved. Slowly. Rhythmic. Like the rise and fall of breathing, the hum from earlier returned, louder this time, pressing against his ribcage as if the air had weight. And then, impossibly, the road exhaled. A gust of hot, damp air rushed up from the ground, carrying that same metallic sweetness, but now sharper, edged with rot. Hank staggered and nearly fell, and the moment his knees bent, the thing beneath the translucent surface rippled violently. Shapes, too quick to fully see, rolled just under the skin of the ground, long and jointed, each ending in a hook or claw that pressed upward as though testing the thin barrier. The footsteps that had shadowed him stopped. The whisper in his head became one word, clear and final, below, and as if obeying its own command, the ground began to sink. He didn't get on it. Not that day. Instead, he took his usual seat in car 4, settled his bag on a floor, and tried to lose himself in the crossword. But his eyes kept drifting to the window, to where he thought the last carriage would be trailing. Of course, from inside, you couldn't see it. The train curves weren't sharp enough on this stretch, and the windows were angled wrong. Still, he couldn't stop picturing it. The black windows. The open door. When the conductor came through to check tickets, Harold almost asked about it. Almost. But something in the man's expression stopped him. Not that the conductor looked unfriendly, exactly, just absent. Like his mind was somewhere far away. Harold rode the whole way to Portsmouth with a nagging itch in his brain. At each stop, passengers got on and off, but when he leaned forward to glance down the length of the train, the last carriage was never in sight. By the time they pulled into Portsmouth, he half convinced himself he'd imagined it. But as he stepped onto the platform and turned back for one last look, there it was, still hitched to the end, still black as a void, and still, impossibly, unnoticed by everyone around him. The rest of the day passed in a blur of spreadsheets, coffee breaks, and polite conversations he couldn't remember 5 minutes later. Harold worked in a small insurance office, a job that was neither exciting nor miserable, which he supposed was a kind of blessing. But his mind kept circling back to the train. That extra carriage. He thought about it at lunch, picking at a sad ham sandwich. He thought about it in the elevator, watching the numbers creep down. By the time he left the office, the idea had taken root. Maybe it wouldn't be there on the evening train. Maybe it had just been a fluke. The 5:45 back to Chelsea rolled in right on time. 7 cars. Harold felt a mix of relief and disappointment he couldn't quite untangle. But as he settled into his seat, he had the uneasy sense that something had changed in him. Like he'd stepped through a doorway without meaning to, and now there was no way back. The dream started that night. Not the usual jumbled nonsense about missed appointments and forgetting your pants. These were sharp, vivid things. In the first one, he stood alone on a platform shrouded in thick, oily fog. A train pulled in slow and silent, and he saw the last carriage waiting at the end. The door opened wider this time, and though he couldn't see inside, he felt warmth spilling out, the kind of warmth that made you think of hearth fires and safe places. A voice low, coaxing, whispered his name from the darkness. He woke with a start, heart hammering, the sound of the whistle still ringing in his ears. When he got up to splash water on his face, he noticed something strange in the mirror, a faint smear on his cheek, as if from soot. He scrubbed it away, telling himself it was nothing. But he didn't sleep much after that. 2 days later, the carriage came back. Same train, same place, same open door. And this time, Harold wasn't the only one who saw it. A young woman in a red scarf paused on the platform, her eyes narrowing as she stared down the length of the train. She took a hesitant step toward the last carriage, then another. Harold found himself doing the same, drawn by some invisible thread. The closer he got, the more he felt it, a humming under his skin, a faint vibration in the air. The woman reached the door first. She glanced at Harold over her shoulder, and for a moment, their eyes met. Then she stepped inside. The door swung shut. The train jerked forward. Harold never saw her again. The last carriage, the door closed behind Harold with the sound of something ancient being sealed shut. Not a slam, but a slow, deliberate click, like a coffin lid finding its groove. The air inside was warm, as he'd always imagined from his dreams, but it wasn't the hearth-fire warmth he'd hoped for. It was the damp, suffocating warmth of something that had been breathing in the dark for a long, long time. The walls seemed closer than they should have been, upholstered in deep red velvet that looked wet in the dim light. Rows of seats stretch ahead, but every single one was occupied, not by the living, not exactly, but by pale figures whose eyes were opened far too wide. Their faces were slack, their bodies perfectly still, yet Harold could feel them watching him in a way that was deeper than sight, as if their gaze was reaching into his bones. He recognized some of them, the woman in the red scarf, the fisherman with the humming tune, even the short woman in the green coat who always rushed for her morning coffee. They were all here, sitting in silence, waiting. A shiver ran down his spine as the realization hit. They weren't passengers on their way to somewhere. They were passengers on their way out. The drop was slow at first, almost graceful, as if the road were lowering him into some unseen pit. The glowing eye remained above, still and watchful, its light shrinking as the edges of the world rose around him like the lip of a crater. The pale, leathery surface under his boots stretched and warped, groaning faintly with the strain of his weight. Beneath it, those hooked shapes moved faster now, weaving in and out of each other like eels in black water. Hank tried to run, but each step was heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but because the ground seemed to cling to his soles, a tacky pull that grew stronger the more he fought it. Then, without warning, the membrane beneath him tore. The sound was wet, a rip followed by a spray of warm mist that clung to his face and arms. Hank fell forward, catching himself on his palms, and saw the truth beneath the skin of the earth, a vast cavity lined with something like muscle and cartilage, pulsing faintly as if alive. The shapes he'd glimpsed before emerged fully now, elongated limbs tipped with hooks, their surfaces slick and colorless, each moving independently yet in a disturbingly coordinated rhythm. They didn't reach for him at first. They hovered, twitching slightly, as though tasting the air around his body. The whisper returned, stronger than ever, but this time it was not alone. Dozens of voices layered over each other, all speaking the same phrase in different tones, pitches, and tempos. Down here, down here, down here. It was hypnotic, almost soothing, and against all reason, Hank felt himself leaning forward, the yawning cavity beneath him no longer terrifying but strangely inviting. The glowing eye above dimmed, shrinking into the black until it was gone, and with its absence came the first touch, one of the hooked limbs brushing lightly against his ankle. The contact burned cold, the chill racing up his leg faster than he could pull away. And in that frozen instant, he realized something that made his stomach turn. The limb wasn't pulling him down, it was holding him still, waiting for something larger to arrive. The night had grown impossibly black, the kind of black that swallows headlights whole, leaving the road ahead like a yawning throat. Sam's hands were locked on the wheel, so tightly his knuckles were chalk white, the leather groaning under his grip. Beside him, Marla hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. Not since the last time they'd seen something in the rearview mirror that should not have been there. It hadn't been a car. No headlights. Just a vague, shifting darkness that clung to the asphalt and moved when they moved, like it was stalking the tires. Sam tried not to look at it, because every time his eyes drifted toward that reflection, the shadows inside it seemed to notice, and then they would pulse forward, closer, gaining ground without actually moving. The gas station attendant's warning replayed in his head, a needle on a warped record. Don't be on that road after dark. Not unless you want them to ride with you. He couldn't shake the way the old man had said them. Not as a joke, not as some tourist scare tactic, but like a confession. Sam had thought it was just superstition, maybe even a way to keep people from getting themselves killed on an unlit highway. But now, as the desert air seemed to thicken, and the shadows began stretching too far into the beam of their headlights, the idea of them felt horribly real. His eyes burned from keeping them open so wide, scanning the shoulders of the road for any sign of life. Though by now he knew that whatever life was out here didn't move the way people did. The road signs had all vanished, too. Not just a gap between them vanished. For the past half hour, they'd been driving past nothing but a flat horizon, endless asphalt, and a moon that seemed glued to the same spot in the sky. No matter how far they went, Marla finally broke the silence. Sam, she whispered, like raising her voice would be an invitation. I think they're inside. He glanced at her, then back to the road, his stomach tightening. Inside what? She didn't answer right away, her eyes darting toward the back seat. Sam didn't want to follow her gaze, but some stubborn part of his brain, some corner that still wanted the truth, even if it was poison, forced him to look. At first, there was nothing. Just their worn duffel bag, a couple of takeout wrappers, and the dark space between the seats. Then something shifted. Not moved, shifted, like the shadows themselves were rearranging, spilling over the seat in slow, syrupy waves. Sam's throat closed. It wasn't a shape he could describe, not exactly. But he could feel it watching him, the air in the car pressing down harder with every heartbeat. He looked back at the road so fast he nearly swerved. Last stop on Gravedigger's Highway, Part 1. The desert at dusk isn't quiet, not if you really listen. There's the dry rattle of wind against dead yucca stalks, the distant whine of a half-broken billboard turning lazily on rusted hinges. And under all that, a faint hum, like something alive, bleeding up from the blacktop itself. It was that hum that first made Jason ease off the gas. He had been driving for nearly 8 hours, heading west toward Reno. The highway was a thin, lonely ribbon through a landscape of stone and dust. He had passed 2 cars all day. Both had been heading the other way. The sun was a molten red coin, sinking into the jagged teeth of the mountains, painting the whole sky in bruised oranges and purples. Shadows were stretching, reaching across the road like fingers. Jason spotted the gas station before he realized how low his tank was. A flickering neon sign buzzed in the hot air. Gas of cold drinks it. The place looked like it had been built in the 1950s and forgotten by the rest of the world. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips. The windows were cloudy with dust. Only one of the 2 pumps seemed to work, its faded numbers locked in place until you squeezed the handle. They pulled in, cut the engine, and listened. The hum from the road was louder now, almost like a faint, steady chant. But when he stepped out, the sound seemed to vanish, swallowed by the dry desert air. The attendant came out of the shadowed doorway like a figure from an old photograph. He was thin, wiry, with skin the color of worn leather and eyes that seemed too pale for the sun. His hair was silver white, but not the soft kind, more like steel wire sticking out from his head. He didn't smile. You headed west? The man asked. His voice was low, gravelly, and carried the weight of someone who had seen too many bad things to count. Jason nodded, trying for a polite smile. Yeah, Reno. How far is it from here? The old man didn't answer right away. He looked past Jason's shoulder down the road, as if measuring something only he could see. Finally, he said, "Long enough. But you'll be needing to stop before dark." Jason laughed nervously. "Yeah, well, I'm used to night driving." The man stepped closer, his eyes hard now. "Not out here, you're not. This stretch, Gravedigger's Highway, they call it, belongs to them after dark." Jason almost asked them who, but there was something in the way the man said it, something so absolute and heavy, that he didn't want to invite the answer. "You can fill up here," the attendant continued. "There's a little diner a mile back. Stay there tonight. Get back on the road after sunrise. If you pass mile marker 117 after sundown..." Well, he trailed off, shaking his head. Jason smirked, trying to hide the creeping unease in his stomach. "What happens then?" The old man looked him dead in the eye. "They'll take you, and you won't be coming back." A shiver ran through Jason despite the heat. He thought about shrugging it off. Just some weird old desert guy trying to spook the tourists. But something in the man's expression made him pause. There wasn't a trace of humor in it. No wink, no smirk. Just bone-deep certainty. Jason filled his tank in silence. The hum from the road seemed to be pulsing now, as if in sync with his heartbeat. When he looked down at the pump, he noticed something odd. The counter never went past $6.66. It clicked over and over, but that was the number locked in place. He turned to tell the attendant, but the man was already backing into the shadows of the store. "Don't drive past dusk," he said one last time. And then the door shut. The wind along Gravedigger's Highway had a sound that night, not just the hiss of sand dragging across asphalt, not just the moan of desert emptiness. It was a layered sound, like something underneath was whispering, like there were 100 voices pressed against the walls of the night, all speaking at once in a language you couldn't quite understand but could feel deep inside your teeth. Mike had been on roads like this before, forgotten desert strips where the horizon stretched so far you thought you could fall into it, but this was different. It was the way the darkness seemed thick, how his headlights didn't push it back so much as carve a narrow path through it, like a flashlight beam through smoke. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw only blackness. The gas station's lonely neon glow was long gone now, just a faint memory in his mind. The attendant's warning echoed again, "Don't drive past dusk." That part was easy enough to replay in his head. The words were burned into him like a brand, but the way the old man's eyes had looked when he'd said it, that was what stuck. They'd been wide and unblinking, the kind of look you give a man who's already standing on the edge of the grave and doesn't know it yet. And then, of course, the old man's voice dropping lower, almost to a whisper. He night after the first encounter was not quiet. Ethan didn't sleep. He couldn't. The motel bed creaked at every small movement, and the silence between the creaks was heavy, thick, almost sticky. Somewhere in the corner of the room, the old wall clock ticked in a slow, uneven rhythm, like a heartbeat struggling to keep pace. It was the kind of sound that made you realize you were alone, or made you wish you were. His mind replayed the gas station attendant's words over and over. "Don't drive past dusk. The road belongs to them after dark." The word had weight now. Not just a caution from some desert eccentric. It was heavier, sharper, like a name whispered in an empty church. Ethan didn't know who they were, but every instinct in his bones told him the gas station man hadn't been joking. By 3:14 a.m., the air in the room had grown stale. Ethan pushed the covers aside and sat up, his bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. Outside the window, the highway shimmered faintly under the silver moonlight, stretching endlessly into the black Nevada desert. No cars, no wind, not even the chirp of crickets. Just stillness, the kind that pressed against your chest until you had to breathe just to remind yourself you could. At 4 a.m., you heard it at a faint hum. It wasn't a car engine exactly. It was smoother, like the sound of metal sliding over glass. He moved toward the window and squinted into the darkness. That's when he saw it, faint headlights far down the road. 2 beams of light, except they didn't bounce or flicker like normal headlights. They glided, perfectly parallel, perfectly steady, and they were moving fast. In the time it took for Ethan to blink, the lights had halved the distance to the motel. He stepped back, the curtain brushing his cheek. Something deep inside screamed at him to not be seen. But curiosity, that old, dangerous itch, kept him there for a second too long. The lights reached the edge of the motel lot and stopped. Just stopped. Ethan's skin prickled. The 2 beams hung in the dark like watching eyes, silent, unblinking. His breath quickened. He didn't know why, but he felt sure that if he moved too suddenly, something bad would happen. And then slowly the lights went out, but the darkness didn't swallow them up. No. It felt thicker now, as if the lights had only been masking something behind them, something still there. By dawn, Ethan was packed. He didn't care if the desert sun fried him alive, he just needed to keep moving. The gas station was the only landmark before the highway swallowed you whole, so he stopped again, hoping maybe the old man would have more answers in the light of day. But the station was empty, not just closed, empty. The door hung half open, swaying slightly on one hinge. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and something else, something sweet and rotten. The counter was dusty. The coffee pot sat cold and untouched. And behind the counter, the stool where the old man had sat last night was toppled over on its side. Ethan's mouth went dry. He called out once, twice. No answer. He stepped outside, scanning the barren horizon. In the dirt lot beside the station, there were tire tracks, but not normal ones. They were deep, evenly spaced, and led straight off the road into the desert. No turns, no curves, just a dead straight path into nothingness. And then, in the corner of the lot, half buried in sand, Ethan saw it. A crumpled gas station attendant's cap. The desert wind rose again, hot and restless, carrying with it the faintest sound, not the rush of sand or the rattle of pebbles, but something more deliberate, like slow footsteps pacing just out of sight. Hank froze in mid-step, his flashlight beam quivering in his hand. The cone of light fell on the asphalt ahead, showing nothing but the endless ribbon of Gravedigger's Highway stretching into blackness. Yet the sound persisted, scraping closer, until it seemed to come from the very edges of the dark where the light couldn't reach. Somewhere beyond, the air was heavier, as if the night itself was leaning forward to listen. Hank's pulse hammered in his ears, but the silence between each scraping step was worse than the sound itself, like the thing following him was enjoying the pause, savoring the chase. His mind told him to turn back to the gas station, but the instinct that kept him alive all these years screamed not to turn his back. He gripped the flashlight tighter, his fingers slick with sweat, and forced himself to keep walking toward the faint glow of his truck's taillights far ahead, each step an act of will. But the truth was already dawning. That glow might not belong to his truck at all. Somewhere deep in the dark, a voice began to whisper, not from any one direction, but from everywhere at once, as if the wind had learned to speak. It said his name, drawing it out like a thread, making it stretch thin and fray at the edges. Hank's heart stuttered.